Hi, in this video I'll talk about some of the basal chordates and the early vertebrates and the early evolution of the more basal vertebrates like the cartilaginous fishes. So the chordates first appeared, like most of the animal phyla that are around today, during the Cambrian period. At least that's when we have the earliest fossils of them. Of course, like many of the early animals, they were very soft-bodied and so didn't fossilize very well. A calcified skeleton had not evolved yet. So this fossil here, this is one of the early chordate fossils, although there are several different, obviously different species that existed during the Cambrian that were certainly chordates. Chordates belong to the group or the clade of Deuterostomia. That also includes the echinoderms and the hemichordates. The chordates are, the group is named for the notochord. The notochord forms during embryonic development very early and persists into adulthood for the more basal chordates, but not in the vertebrates. So here is our lineage here. So our sister group here, the echinoderms, to all of the chordates here. So we have our defining trait here, the notochord, and we'll talk about the two basal groups of chordates here, the Cephalochordates and the Urochordates, and then our primitive jawless fishes, and then the jawed fishes. And in this video, we will get up through the fishes, and then in the next videos we'll talk about the terrestrial vertebrates. So the derived characters of chordates that are not shared with other phyla are having a notochord, that's what the group is named for, having a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So for other groups that have a nerve cord, it tends to be on the ventral side, like for arthropods. The nerve cord is on the ventral side or the belly side. In chordates, it's on the dorsal side or the back. There are muscle segments as well, which is what indicates that chordates are a segmented organism. The post-anal tail, so for many organisms, the tail, the opening of the digestive system is right at the very tip of the tail, but not for the chordates. And there are also pharyngeal arches, which in the more primitive chordates develop into gills, and in more advanced chordates have adapted to form other structures, which we'll talk about. So the notochord is an embryonic structure that persists into adulthood only for some of the chordates. And the evolutionary advantage for having a notochord is for swimming. So the early chordates had a notochord that persisted through from the larval to the adult stages, and this provides something for the muscles of the body to push against and allow this back and forth swimming motion that is characteristic of all of the swimming chordates, except for some of the mammals that have readapted to life in the sea and they move up and down instead of side to side. But this is the remnants of the notochord. So this little colorized sketch here, this is a slice through a typical early embryo of any chordate. And we have the notochord here. Here is the gut or the endoderm, our mesoderm with the coelom. That's going to end up forming the muscles and the skeleton. Our ectoderm, and the nervous tissue here actually forms from the ectoderm and during embryonic development rolls up into a tube. And that happens in all chordates from the lancelets all the way to humans. That's how the nervous system forms, that it forms from ectoderm. And the nerve cord, again, allows for the development of a brain, and the very most primitive chordates don't really seem to have much of a brain at all, but this allowed this having an anterior and a posterior end to the nervous system instead of just a nerve net, allowed the evolution of both a head and a brain. The pharyngeal arches are also another really important characteristic of chordates. Now, in the more primitive chordates and in all the fish, the pharyngeal arches end up forming the gills. So the pharynx is the throat. It's an interior structure that leads to the digestive tract and also the lungs in vertebrates that have lungs. During embryonic development, the gills start to form, and the tissue, the fleshy part of it, is called the arch. So the pharyngeal arches are the fleshy part, and in between the arches we have clefts or valleys in between there. Now in fish, those will open up and form a connection between the throat and the outside, the water, and that's the gills. So fish take in water through their mouth and flush it out through their gills, and that's how they oxygenate their blood. But in terrestrial vertebrates, those clefts don't open to the outside. Instead, they form other structures in the body, which we'll talk a little bit about. Chordates also have this post-anal tail, and it also helps with swimming in the most primitive chordates and in the fish. So post-anal means after the anus. So this is a continuation of the vertebra, and even in the human embryo, which no apes, including humans, have a tail as an adult, but during embryonic stages, the human embryo does have a tail, and we can see it here in this nice image here. Here is the hind limb, forelimb, and there is the tail. And the human embryonic tail can have up to 12 vertebrae in it, and then it is reabsorbed during embryonic development. So even in vertebrates that don't have a tail as an adult, they do have a tail during embryonic stages. Okay, so here is the chordates. And we will talk about the most basal chordates here, the cephalochordates or the lanceolets, and the tunicates or the urochordates. And DNA has confirmed the position of these basal groups. And then these two here, these are the jawless fishes. And before DNA, it was unclear which of these two, the cephalochordates or the urochordates, were actually the most basal. Were they a single clade? Were the urochordates the most basal clade? Because they do seem they're the kind of the weirdest. The tunicates are the weirdest and the most unlike all the other chordates. But nevertheless, it did not turn out that way. In fact, the cephalochordates most resemble the first chordate seen in the fossil record. So the cephalochordates are the lanceolets, and that is because they look like the surgical tool and because they look sort of like a long blade that surgeons use. And they don't have a brain, although they do have a head end and a tail end, or an anterior end and a posterior end, and they swim directionally. Their pharyngeal slits open up into their pharynx. These act like gills. They suck in water through their mouth, and they are filter feeders. So they're the cirri here at the mouth opening, both trap small food particles for them to eat and filter out larger things that they don't want to get into their digestive tract. And they have a one-way digestive tract. They have a tail, and they swim. They sort of look like little weird headless fish when they swim. They're very rare in most of the world, but there's a few places in the world where they're pretty abundant. But there's very few species, and they're definitely not, what do we want to say, successful at this point. They're kind of an evolutionary remnant at this point. The other basal chordates are the tunicates, and the tunicates really only resemble other chordates during embryonic stages. The rest of the time, they look more like a sponge or a barnacle or something. Sometimes people call them bleeding rocks because they look very rock-like when they're in the ocean. They live in shallow water, stuck to the bottom. They're filter feeders. If you cut them in half, they have red blood, and it looks like a bleeding rock. As adults, they don't really have much of a nervous system. They're pretty much just a filter-feeding stomach as an adult. But as an embryo, they look very much like a chordate. They have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. They have a notochord. They have segmented muscles for swimming. But they don't swim for long. They have small pharyngeal slits, and they do use them as gills. They only swim for a very short time, sometimes only minutes, before they settle down and start to turn into the blob-like adults that they are, which is one of the reasons why it was thought that maybe these were the most basal chordates, but they're actually not. DNA has confirmed that they are not the most basal, that the lancelets are in fact the most basal. So another derived characteristic of the vertebrates is neural crest cells. So neural crest cells, so the vertebrates are not those two groups. So the cephalochordates and the urochordates are basal chordates. They are not vertebrates. The rest of the chordates, which is almost all the chordates, are vertebrates. And one of the characteristics that vertebrates have is special cells called neural crest cells. Neural crest cells, the crest is the edge of the neural tube. So here's our neural tube rolling up. So the neural tissue in chordates starts out as a flat plate, the ectoderm on the outside of the embryo, and it rolls up into a tube, and that tube forms the brain and the spinal cord. Next to it, on the crest of that tube, are these little cells that form from the ectoderm, and they're called the neural crest because of where they form. And they are migratory neural cells, and they migrate out into, they don't migrate everywhere, they only migrate straight out from where they arose. So they're very confined depending on where they started out in the body. So if they started out in the head as neural crest cells, they're going to stay in the head, for example. If they started out in the trunk of the body, they're going to stay in the trunk. But they migrate and produce a huge array of tissues. Many neurons and neural tissue, just like we would expect because they're neural derived during embryonic development, but they also form an assortment of other tissues, including mesoderm-like tissues, including parts of the skull, which here we have a human infant's skull, and everything that's green is formed by the neural crest. So the upper and lower jaw are structures in there. The cartilage and the bone are formed by the neural crest. Parts of the inner ear, parts of the face are formed by the neural crest. And many other structures as well. So neural crest cells form, besides neurons and glial cells, as we'll see when we get to the neurons chapter, glial cells are the support cells of the neurons. The neurons produce a lot of waste products that they can't get rid of, and that's one of the things that glial cells help with. Neural crests produce all the melanocytes in your body. So melanocytes produce all the pigment in our skin. So the reason that you have any pigment in your skin at all is because of the neural crest cells when you were an embryo migrating out from your back all the way around to populate your skin with melanocytes. And this is the reason why it's this migration of melanocytes is the reason why in our domestic animals, when they have white patches, it tends to form a very specific pattern. Like in cats and dogs, we tend to see white socks on their legs and white on their nose and on their neck and on their belly, because that's the last place the neural crest cells go. So one of the things that happens during animal domestication, and we've seen it over and over again with dogs and cats and even with foxes in experiments with domestication just in the last century, that these neural crest cells don't migrate as far. And when that happens, you get unpigmented areas of the body. And this can also happen in humans, but it's much more rare in humans. And then you would see the same kind of thing. You would see a failure of any pigment at all, but just in the hands and the feet and along the midline of the ventral side. Neural crest forms parts of our heart, including one of our heart valves and neurons in the heart, a lot of peripheral neurons and Schwann cells, which surround the neurons. So neural crest cells are very important and have been an important part of the evolution of vertebrates because of their flexibility, because of their flexible developmental program. They have allowed all these new head structures to evolve because of the fact that they move and they mutate, and DNA mutates and causes differences, slight differences in the way the neural crest cells develop. And the neural crest cells have been an important part of vertebrate evolution. Okay, so our most primitive vertebrates here are the jawless fish. So they do have mouths, but they have kind of soft, fleshy mouths. They do not have a bony upper jaw, and they don't have a bony lower jaw. So no mandible and no maxilla. And these jawless fish, there aren't very many species. They used to be much more abundant than they are today. The most basal group, Duke, stop. The most basal group are the hag fishes, and hag fishes are mostly known for the slime that they produce if you pick them up. They're very vulnerable to predators because of their soft bodies, lack of teeth. They just have soft, squishy mouths, which you can see here. They're scavengers. They eat especially large dead things like whale fall. You'll find them eating dead whales and dead dolphins and things on the bottom. So their best defense is if anything tries to bite them, they produce huge amounts of slime. They can produce buckets of slime, a single hagfish can. And that seems to be extremely repellent to predators. So that's probably the reason that the jawless fishes that are around today, the few species of hagfishes that there are, that's why. They don't really have much of a calcified skeleton. In fact, they barely have any vertebra at all. Their vertebrae are reduced to kind of little spines, and it was even debated for a long time whether they're even vertebrates. They do have a notochord as an adult, and that's the main stiffening component of their body. DNA has confirmed, however, that yes, hagfish do belong in the clade of vertebrates. They are not another clade of invertebrates. So even though they're vertebra, the bony backbone that defines vertebrates, even though their vertebra are very minimal. Lampreys are the other group of jawless fishes, and some of these are parasitic, and those are probably the most familiar ones to you. So if you've ever seen a video of a shark swimming and it has another fish clamped onto its side, that's a lamprey. And here's what their mouths look like. They have these backward facing, they're not really teeth, they're more like kind of horny spines. And they clamp onto the skin of the shark or whatever they're attached to. Usually they pick on very large fish to attach to. And then the mouth, the actual mouth is in here. And then they eat the shark that way. They also have a notochord as an adult, and they do have vertebra. They have a little bit more substantial vertebra than hagfish do, but it's not calcified. It's all made of cartilage, and it's not very recognizable as much of a skeleton compared to the rest of the vertebrates. And their pharyngeal arches do form gills. You can see the reduced openings here. They just have holes for the gill openings there. One of the extinct vertebrates that's really interesting that was sort of hagfish-like, they really presented a mystery to paleontologists for a long, long time, and these are the conodonts, because the only hard part in their body, remember the fossil record, is biased towards hard parts. So the conodonts had these horny barb-like teeth and structures inside of their pharynx. And those were the only fossils we had of them for decades. There were piles and piles of these fossils, these conodonts, and scientists speculated for decades, what could the creature be that these came from? Because all we had were these horny things, and with these spikes on them. And it wasn't until the last 20 years that finally some more intact fossils were found of the rest of the body. And then it was like, oh, they're chordates. They're vertebrates. They're very primitive vertebrates, among the earliest vertebrates. So they were sort of like lampreys. And we can kind of see the similarities with the lampreys today with these I don't want to call them bone, because they weren't really bone. They're ectodermal spines that were inside the throat and in their mouth that they used to clamp onto prey. And perhaps some of these were actually parasitic as well, like the lampreys are today. But it was a decades-long mystery in the fossil record. What are these things? What kind of is it? Some kind of a worm? What animal belongs to these fossils? So, mystery solved. Very primitive vertebrate. The jawed fishes, or the gnathostomes. Gnathos just means jaw. What that means is a bony jaw. So, of course, the jawless fish have a soft mouth, but they didn't have hard bones or real teeth. So that was the evolutionary innovation of the gnathostomes, or the jawed fish, was having bony jaws that are hinged and muscles that are attached to them to really clamp down on prey, and then teeth to really grip onto them. Of course, fish don't chew. There aren't any fish today that chew. Fish teeth have the function of grabbing onto prey so that they can be swallowed, not chewing things. They don't chew things. That came way later in evolution. But it turns out that if you look at embryonic development, that bony jaw structure evolved from the first pharyngeal arch. So the first pharyngeal arch changed from a gill opening to the bony structure of the jaw. This is one of the early fossil gnathostomes. So here's our pharyngeal arches with the slits in between that allow the water to pass through. And they do have cartilaginous support, the gills do. And in the gnathostomes, the very first pharyngeal arch, instead of forming the structure of the very first gill slit, instead were co-opted to form the jaw. And it's actually the neural crest cells that form most of this cartilage. The cartilaginous fish, chondrichthyes. So you can see Ichthys here, I-C-H-T-H-Y, that means fish. So whenever you see Ichthys in something, it means fish. Chondro is cartilage, so chondrichthyes is the cartilaginous fish. And these are the fish that have, instead of a calcified hard skeleton, they have a soft cartilage skeleton. And they also have no swim bladder and very primitive gills. So sharks, rays, ratfish. It's another small group there. Skates kind of look like small rays. But if you look at a shark here, you can see those gill slits. They don't have a covering on their gill slits like the bony fish do, which we'll get to. But they do have a set of 4 fins, and this is going to persist with all of the jawed fish. We will see that same structure. Dorsal fins evolve over and over multiple times. Dorsal fins have a particular function during swimming. They're sort of like the keel on a ship. And the dorsal fins, if you're a fish and you're swimming quickly, the tendency is going to be for the body to roll. So the dorsal fins act sort of like a keel on a ship during swimming, and they prevent rotation. They're going to resist rotation. So we see dorsal fins evolve over and over again in fast swimming species. Even we see dorsal fins on whales, who only recently, relatively recently, re-evolved to life in the sea, and they re-evolved dorsal fins as a needed mechanism to help prevent rolling during swimming. But you can see not all cartilaginous fish have them because they don't need them, because they're mostly bottom feeders. The rays and the skates and the ratfish are bottom feeders. They're not fast swimmers. The cartilaginous fish, one of the reasons that the cartilaginous fish were thought to be more basal or an earlier lineage than the bony fish, which we'll talk about next, is because they totally lack a swim bladder. A swim bladder is a gas-filled structure that we now know evolved from lungs and helps bony fish maintain their buoyancy so they can maintain neutral buoyancy in the water, so that if they stop swimming, they don't sink or float. They're neutrally buoyant. Sharks are not neutrally buoyant. Sharks, if they don't swim, they sink to the bottom. And so that's why when sharks or rays rest, they actually sit on the bottom. And they do that. I mean, there's quite extensive documentation of sharks resting on the bottom. This is a little video of a manta ray swimming. Their manta rays are large rays. They're filter feeders. It almost looks like they're flying. They have a kind of unique way of moving through the water. Once we get to the bony fish, that's the next group. So osteo, remember, means bone. You hear that root all the time in medicine. So osteo, let me get my pointer back here. Osteo means bone, so the osteichthyans are the bony fish. And that's almost all of the fish that you're familiar with are bony fish. If it's not a shark or ray, it's probably a bony fish. So goldfish, tuna, eels, they're all bony fish. Probably all the fish you eat are bony fish. Not too many people eat sharks. And this clade, the clade that includes bony fish, also includes us, the tetrapods, which we'll talk about them in the next video. So the bony fish are divided into the Rayfin fishes and the lobe-finned fishes. So the more basal lineage is the Rayfin fish, the Actinopterygii, and then the lobe-finned fish, or the Sarcopterygii. And there's 2 clades of them. But let's talk about the Rayfin fish. So what do we mean by Rayfin? What's a Rayfin? What does that mean? So inside of a Rayfin fish's fin is long, bony sticks, if you want to think of it that way, long, bony elements. But there's no muscles in the fin. All the muscles are in the body. So they have these little rays sticking out that move the fin, but there's no muscles in the fin itself. All the muscles are in the body wall, and the body moves the fins. Those are Rayfin fishes because the fins have these rays in them, these little bony rays. And they're, you know, they can use them in very advanced ways, but there's no muscle in the fin. The muscles are all in the body. That's a Rayfin fish. And that's most of the fishes that we're familiar with. They are, the Rayfin fishes are a super abundant lineage. And if you hear a dog barking, that is not my dog's barking. That is the neighbor's dog's barking today. Oh, I have a neighbor whose dog, if it's outside, it's barking. Barks at the sky, barks at leaves, barks at plastic bags, barks at everything. So the Rayfin fish are bony fish, the Actinopterygii, and these are all of our familiar fish and some really weird ones, like besides like tuna and goldfish and tilapia, salmon, they're all Actinopterygii. Some weird things like seahorses are actually bony fish, eels are bony fish, some, you know, lionfish would be more recognizable. There are extremely tiny ones that are only millimeters in length as adults, and there are huge ones that weigh 500, 600 pounds at maturity. So a big range of sizes. Almost all of them have external fertilization of the eggs and completely external development, although there are a few that are viviparous, which means they give birth to live young. But that's an unusual trait in Rayfin fish. The lobefin fish are the two groups that are more closely related to us, the tetrapods. And you'll notice that I'm kind of working our way to us because, of course, we like studying things. The closer something is related to us, the more research money that's available, the more scientists that study it. The further away it is from us, the fewer people are studying it, or, you know, that's just how humans are. We're really interested in ourselves. So the lobe fins, or the Sarcopterygii, it turns out DNA evidence has shown that they are not a single clade, but in fact form two different groups, and tetrapods, us, are kind of embedded in there. So the coelacanths are one group, and the lungfish are the other group. And it turns out that the lungfish are more closely related to us and the early amphibians. So what's a lobe fin? What does that mean, lobe fin? What's different about lobe fins than ray fins? So the lobe fin fish have these fleshy fins. Now they still have the same 4 fins on the ventral side, but there are muscles and bones inside the fin. So they can move the fins themselves. They're not just little bony rays sticking out, but instead they have little club-like bones and muscles inside the fin itself, and many of them use them for walking. Like lungfish can walk between ponds. They can't travel very far on land, but they have been known to travel a mile or two at night when it's not hot and sunny on land to go from one pond to another pond, and they use their fleshy lobe fins to walk on moist ground to go from one place to another. And they do have kind of primitive lungs. They can't use them exclusively, but it's thought that lungs originally evolved in fish, and all the bony fish either have lungs or have swim bladders, which evolved from lungs, to gulp air when the water that they lived in was very oxygen poor. So water can be very low in oxygen, especially fresh water, and that happens to be where lungfish live. There aren't any lungfish in the ocean. They live in fresh water in shallow, muddy, murky lakes and ponds, And that's exactly where we think lungs in fish first became useful. If you live in a very oxygen-poor environment, evolving the ability to gulp air and get oxygen would be a big evolutionary advantage. So here we have a coelacanth, and this is a fossil coelacanth. Coelacanths have an interesting story because they were thought to have gone extinct with the dinosaurs. The most recent fossils that we have of coelacanths are 75 million years old. So it was thought that there weren't any more living coelacanths, and they were one lobe-fin fish that was extinct. But it turned out that they're still around. They were rediscovered in the 1930s off the coast of South Africa by fishermen who were fishing much deeper than they normally would because, of course, fishing stocks are being fished out, and they had the ability to fish deeper and deeper, and the need to because fishing stocks are running out. And they started pulling up these huge fish. And now they are now banned from being fished because it turns out that they have an extremely slow reproductive rate. They might live for several hundred years each, and it could be really easy to fish them to extinction. And they also don't taste very good. People were catching them and chopping them up and using them for bait to catch other fish. But they're very interesting, and it turns out that now that we have their DNA, that they are, although they are lobe-finned fish, they're not as closely related to us as lungfish. And we will talk about that in the next video, the evolution of terrestrial vertebrates, or the tetrapods.